Okay, today we are going to discuss, or at least I'm going to discuss to myself. But if anybody wants to join in, just post a comment and a question or question in the chat, and I will reply. I was watching the Turner Classic Movie Channel, and they had a great movie from the year my mom was born, and which was almost 90 years ago. And it was on psychic amnesia. It used the phrase psychic amnesia. And I thought that's interesting because I had never heard that phrase, psychic amnesia. But then it turns out it was actually in the academic literature published in 1909. I did a blog post on it that I'll post in the chat here for the link. So if you scroll way down, the movie was called The Garden Murder Case, and it was very much like the game of Clue, only the I I hate to spoil it, but it's not on YouTube. Well, actually, the trailer's for it on YouTube, but I mean, it's a pretty predictable plot, and they describe that he solves it using hypnosis. So the killer secretly studied in the Far East and had a certain gleam in his eye that was able to hypnotize people. Hello. Feel free to post a comment or question in the chat. And so, of course, like a typical Hollywood movie, they use they have to use a device to make it more realistic. So they used a mirror uh, that reflects the light to hypnotize the person. And so the killer, since the killer trained in the Far East, therefore he's relying on this evil of deep sleep that the person will never wake up from, and then he convinces the person to kill themselves, and it's a terrible thing. Oh, and they also call it paganism. It's the pagan gleam in the eye. Um, so good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Okay, so I'll keep talking to myself. So they use the term pagan and gleam in the eye, and I'm like, wait a second. And traveled in the Far East, I can relate to all of this like very literally. Like for me, it's all too real. But of course, they depict it as evil powers, and I would argue that actually, the West is more relying on the gleam in the eye as evil powers, as hypnotic evil that I call the psychic vampire. Like Drumpf, I would say Drumpf relies on this ability, and it's based on the frequency of the gleam being the biophotons. And so the frequency in the body is actually the intention of the person, and it becomes hardwired during puberty. And so Gurdjieff had a great system where he would, based on, it was similar to Mahayana Buddhism, but he would say like the number one person is hardwired with their frequencies stuck in their lower body, or what he called the center of gravity. And I call this the magnetic moment of the virtual photons, which is a mouthful, obviously. But by virtual photons and magnetic moment, what I'm talking about is basically like the soul. So the frequency being non-commutative and non-local. So it's like your memory as a soul being hardwired. So it's like it's this newly discovered magnetic force that's anti-gravitic. And Andrija Puharich first discovered this, and then he was working doing military psychic research, mind control research, and um and anyway, so essentially what happens is that in the West we try to repress our emotions through left brain dominance using right hand external technology. And so that's what religion tries to do, is repress it. But the problem is the left brain is too weak on its own to repress the subconscious drives, the instinctual drives that Gurdjieff would call like a number one person. So the like the lower, the what in the West, psychologically they call libido. And so this is what the movie is very much based on, this Freudian trying to control the libido of other people to then cause harm, as what I call the psychic vampire. But it's very much based on patriarchy, and of course the evil guy's a man who studied the Far East secretly. But again, I would argue this is going on all the time in the West, and that Drumpf, the current leader of the so-called free world, is actually a psychic vampire. And of course, it's quite amazing that even the people who wrote books on Epstein, um, that have focused on Epstein, they haven't focused on the obvious relation that Drumpf had with Epstein. Anybody can find this out. Where Sarah Ransom, she settled against Epstein, and then she said that she was friends with another victim of Epstein who said that she would have to go service Drumpf or get abused by Drumpf, regularly at Epstein's Manhattan mansion. I think her name was like Jenny or something. And then Sarah Ramson had threats against her family, and she had to flee to England. But she's a credible witness. I mean, she won a legal settlement against Epstein. And so, the corporate media tried to dismiss her, saying, well, she retracted her claims. But actually, she said later on, she just retracted her claims because of the threats against her family. And the claim that she supposedly retracted was that there was video, lots of video documents that about Epstein, and obviously that's true. Everybody knows that the FBI. So my point is like, well, the so-called leader of the free world is actually like the lowest scum evil in prison. That's what that somebody put in prison for that kind of crime is treated the worst in prison because they're considered the lowest scum evil in prison. But because in the West we try to repress our emotions, therefore a psychic vampire will actually activate that lower body energy. And so if somebody doesn't know the intention behind it, like the frequency is based on the intention. So in other words, instead of the energy being sublimated, it's being activated and then fed off as a downward direction, by the male psychic vampire. And so this is what Robert Sapolsky talked about. He wrote the book, The Trouble with Testosterone. And so like when he was being interviewed by Joe Rogan was fawning over Sapolsky as like the greatest ever. And then Sapolsky goes, well, testosterone makes people stupid. And Rogan, obviously, he pretended not to hear Sapolsky. All of a sudden, he just ignored it. But he couldn't ignore it because Sapolsky said it very, prominently. And so he comes back. Rogan tries to come back to the testosterone issue and tries to like redirect it. And Sapolsky just says, well, it's more complicated than that. And that's it. And what Sapolsky was really getting at was that if you read his books, which I already read his books, and I even corresponded with Sapolsky back like 20 years ago. But he points out that the male, and I quote him, I was quoted by him, or my quote of him was then quoted in an op-ed that somebody did for their university student newspaper. But essentially, the male physiology Unlike the male spikes the stress cortisol in the sex drive, whereas the female stays in the parasympathetic nervous system. And so this is what the Harvard medical doctor Herbert Benson calls it the relaxation response, which is essentially how Tumo is explained for the Tibetan yogis that Wim Hof relies on for teaching. And there was just a talk done by a couple of Westerner women who were talking to Tibetan, or they were Tibetan yogis, but they were based in, I think, Bhutan. And they were basically saying how Wim Hof is teaching Tumo wrong, and because it's actually very dangerous, and the heat that's created is a side effect of this emptiness non-dualism that eventually would lead to what they called yogic suicide, which is a phrase I had never heard, but essentially they're saying that the final stage of the process is for your spirit to leave your body permanently, which is when you're making the rainbow body. But in fact, in Taoist alchemy, the goal is to create this immortal golden body, which is called the Yang Shen, which is the same as bilocation in Western mysticism. There's been a few Western saints that have bilocated or been claimed to have bilocated their bodies. So how is this possible? Again, I argue that this is explained by what's called the magnetic moment of virtual photons. And there was just a study published in Quanta magazine, which is one of the popular science online journals, about the study of creating heavy matter from stars and recreating that using accelerators. So they're able to. I think they're calling it neutron. I can't remember if it's like neutron capture. I think that's the process, but essentially, I don't remember all the details, but essentially you're adding a proton and you're turning a neutron into a proton or something like that. And by doing that, you're able to create gold and platinum. And if I said that right, but so they're in iron. They're figuring out, well, how is new matter actually created from just hydrogen and plasma, and protons and just basic atoms. And so the argument here is that if you study Sir Roger Penrose, he points out that the actual power of stars is not just from the fusion, because the fusion relies on quantum entanglement, but he's saying that it actually comes from gravitational potential energy. And the gravitational potential energy itself relies on this asymmetric time that originates from this quantum negative entropy. And the quantum negative entropy is not just asymmetric time, but it's called non-commutativity. And so Penrose then points out that he's not good at non-commutative mathematics. And he co-wrote an article with somebody who does specialize in non-commutative math. But basically he's saying, this is the real truth of creating new matter. And so that's what I'm arguing is happening in meditation when you have bilocation. It's not just that all matter is made of light, which is what Gerard de Hooft argues also with Martin Vandermark in their article, Light is Heavy. And Gerard de Hooft also has a Nobel Prize like Roger Penrose. And then they started to have a debate in a live stream a couple years ago, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, or maybe it was 5 years ago. But then the moderator cut them off, which I thought was kind of, actually, they both had Nobel Prizes at the time. So it was maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. But anyway, so even so, mainstream science admits that matter is actually made of light, and it also admits that you can create new matter, but that's where things get hazy. And so what I'm arguing is that if you realize, because of non-commutativity, the virtual photons are not just a mathematical fiction, because Feynman for quantum electrodynamics. He argued that the renormalization process is just a mathematical fiction where you're canceling out infinity by changing the mass of the rest frame as an observer measurement process, and therefore you're able to then have these virtual matter just cancel out and not really exist. But there's already been experiments where they convert virtual photons into actual photons, and Sir John Pendry says this is all due to negative frequency. And so the secret of negative frequency is actually very simple, but it got covered up at the origin of Western science. And so this was also the secret of non-Western meditation, is this idea of negative frequency and also a time reversed precognitive force. So it's not just a magnetic force, but it's gravitationally repulsive. And this has been proven in the weak measurement experiments where they're using entangled photons, and they actually call it a gravitationally repulsive force in the experiments. And so in the mystic tradition, you also get levitation when you have this really deep meditation. And the best case of that is Saint Joseph de Cupertino, who had a couple books written about him by Michael Grosso, along with the translator that he worked with, who translated the Italian biography of Saint Joseph de Cupertino. And so I recently commented on Professor Michael Grosso's blog about how you had to have celibacy in order to really activate these paranormal spiritual powers, that celibacy is required. And he just said, well, that's too redundant. And so this is, I pointed out to him that Swami Vivekananda describes spirituality as just sublimated sexuality. And so again, as Westerners, we're taught that you're supposed to just repress sexuality, with the left brain, like self-censor it. But what the East is pointing out is that's not strong enough. And so you're required to do these physical body exercises. So Gurdjieff would have people focus on physical labor, because it turns out, standing exercise is what's really required by males in order to sublimate, not just sublimate, but also purify the energy. So what you're doing is you're activating this relaxation response by getting a what's called a parasympathetic rebound. So you're pushing the sympathetic nervous system to the extreme, and then it causes a parasympathetic rebound. So like Wim Hof, he does this with cold showers. But you can also do it with like really hot showers. If you ever notice, like, hot showers, you'll get a extreme sympathetic nervous system response, but then your pores expand, from the heat, as a parasympathetic response. So like it just goes to the opposite extreme in the nervous system. Well, what meditation is doing is saying that process is actually driven by the biophotons as spirit, or what they call in Taoism is called Shen. And so in the West, we've been taught to think, ghosts aren't really real. But in the East, through deep meditation, what I experienced was that each of us actually does have a ghost inside of us, which is a coherent biophoton body that then leaves the body when the heart stops. And so the idea of meditation is you're turning that light around as a coherent biophoton soul, essentially, that then resonates with its source. And that source is then essentially precognitive, and it stores your memory, but it stores it in this non-local overlap of the future and the past. So that's why when you go deep into meditation, you can have these precognitive visions that are then more real than being awake, because you're accessing the future through this, what in Taoism is called the Wan Shen. And the Wan Shen is also called this light of no light, and in Tibetan Buddhism, it's called the clear light. So it's a paradox. So like in Taoism, they just say you can hear with your eyes. In other words, the non-commutativity is actually a synesthesia, where you're relying on your listening process to then access this superluminal virtual photon energy. That's, since it's faster than the speed of light, it actually is the source of all your other perceptions, and so your ability to then see becomes more vivid in this precognitive visionary realm. But it's actually relying on this force that can't be inherently cannot be seen. And so that's a big problem in the West, is because we grow up as what's called materialistic idealism, which is another way of just saying seeing is believing, and you have to have reproducible experiments for it to be scientific. But what non-commutativity is arguing um, is that the exact opposite is true. Is my own quantum physics professor, Herbert J. Bernstein, he had his research classified top secret by the NSA and for NASA, and the whole secret is that the non-commutativity means if there's any kind of encryption cracking of the code, then it will change the content. In other words, the form of the information is inherently also the content. And so the process of measurement itself is part of the content of the information. And so this is a whole new way of defining information. And this is what Basil J. Hiley and David Bohm called active information. And so, like math professor Luke Hoffman, he says that every time you make an external measurement, it takes time to make the measurement. And this seems pretty obvious, but it was actually dismissed all the way back in the 1600s by Simon Stevin when he was making logarithmic measurements in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And he's just saying, well, if you look at the irrational number, like a square root of 2, it's obvious that it would take an infinite amount of time to actually make it a precise measurement, and nobody can actually physically make that measurement process. And so therefore we can just logically deduce a reductio ad absurdum that the square root of 2 is the geometric magnitude, of that's required for a precise external measurement. But what that process is covering up is the non-commutative time frequency. That's the origin of the ratios that are being measured. And so when you're relying on a logical inference process as listening, then the process of measurement itself is inherent to the actual content of the information. And so this got rediscovered by Heisenberg when he was studying the spectroscopy of Ritz-Rydberg, and then realized that you have this inherent, well, he didn't know it was non-commutative, but he did the algebra, and then his advisor, Bohr, then realized, Niels Bohr realized that it's non-commutative, and the mathematics would be the matrices mathematics. And then he had Pascual Jordan develop this matrices math for the quantum physics. And so anyway, this non-commutativity then got covered up because what it essentially means is you have an inherent secrecy to reality that's going on all the time from the future. And so this is what gets recreated, like when my own quantum physics professor, Herbert J. Bernstein, developed non-locality experiments. So he was the National Science Foundation administrator for Anton Zeilinger's Bell inequality experiments that then got the Nobel Prize in 2022. And So the meaning of that Nobel Prize on Bell's inequality is still being debated because, again, as Basil J. Haley points out, most physicists do not understand non-locality. So the difference between non-locality and quantum entanglement is that in quantum entanglement, it's assumed you're creating the non-locality. And so even my own physics professor, what the he agreed with David Bohm. He called them Bohmian dialogues, but the original meaning was that a quantum physicist is actually creating reality because the way they set up the experiment and they do the measurement, it's going to change the actual outcome of reality. The way they have the entanglement in the measurement process. And so the measurement process will be different each time they make the measurement. And this goes against how science has been defined up till now, where most people are still assuming, if you want real science, it's got to be a repeatable experiment, um, and it's got to be seen as believing. But when you're dealing with quantum entanglement, it's inherently not seeable, and you have this non-local action at a distance. And this is what Professor Jean Brimon, really emphasizes in his explanation of Bell's inequality. He's given several lectures on it. And I've corresponded with him, and he even sent me one of his lectures that he gave at NYU for Professor Tim Maudlin. And so he's pointing out that even Stephen Hawking did not understand Bell's inequality because of this spooky action at a distance that Einstein could not believe. But Einstein at least acknowledged that this would have to be going on for quantum physics to actually be claiming what's happening is actually happening. And so what Basil G. Haley was emphasizing is that it's not just non-local, but it's also non-commutative. And by being non-commutative, what that means is that before anyone makes any measurement, any external measurement, at zero time, there already is this inherent process going on that's an active information of the future and the past overlapping as an eternal motion. And so it's like the same thing from Heraclitus, where you can't step in the same river twice, but the river's always moving, and this is what pre-Socratic philosophy originally taught, as does Taoism and even Buddhism, is that you have this eternal motion of reality. And so you can listen to it. And if you listen to it, then you're able to resonate with that eternal moving energy. And by doing that, you're able to cause an exorcism of these otherwise what would be just called energy blockages. And so that's why in Buddhism, there's actually no definition of the soul. The soul does not exist because you have this, what they call the five skandhas, which means coverings, but essentially they're the lower emotional blockages of the spirit or ghost that would then leave the body. And so Taoism is very similar to like Egyptian alchemy, where you have the two different kinds of spirits in the body that then make up the soul. So they're both what would be called yin spirits. But in meditation, you're turning that into a yang spirit or yang shen by reversing this whole process of what would otherwise be, a natural death process to turning into a ghost. And then part of your spirit just stays with your physical body. And that's why in the traditional Taoist culture, the grave sites with the body are important because there's still energy to the decaying, bones. The bones store up biophoton energy also. And so the final process, like if you're a really advanced yogi, like in Tibetan meditation, you'd have the ability to like shrink your body because you're actually feeding off what in Taoism is called the Po soul, or the Yang Shen would be tied to this Po soul. So it's tied to the Yang Qi. So you have it's still a Yin Shen, but it's the Yang Qi. And so that's what is called the lung energy, but it's also white light. So like in Western culture, we think of white as being good and black as being bad, but in traditional Taoist culture, white is actually the color of a ghost. And so white is actually like what you would wear to a funeral instead of black. From my understanding, like I first learned this from my high school best friend, who moved back to Taiwan. So, but and I remember just being really fascinated by this. So like, wait a second, because he would wear black all the time to school, and as Westerners, we're supposed to think, well, that's black is bad or evil or whatever. But in traditional Chinese culture, black is actually like willpower. It's a strong, good thing. Like they recommend eating black beans as a good source of whatever iron, and it's good for your health, or like mushrooms. Black is good source of vitamin D, and vitamin D is now proven to reduce brain. It keeps your brain healthy and all sorts of good things. So um, so okay, to get back to what I'm just trying to do is compare this difference between how ever since 90 years ago when these movies are coming out, we've been trained to think that Eastern meditation is actually hypnosis, and it's actually an attempt to try to control other people. But what's actually going on is you have this subtle difference between the spiritual ego and the emptiness, and it is a difficult thing to realize um, because as Westerners we are taught to think seeing is believing, and so the spiritual ego is actually your spirit, and so in Vedic Brahmanism, that actually is the origin of Western philosophy because it's based on symmetry in the ritual geometry mathematics. And so it's actually called the Brahmin code, the Brahmin cipher. You can read Western math books and they will refer to the Brahmin cipher. And I quote this in my 2012 book. But essentially it's the symmetric logic of mathematics, the commutative geometry. And um so the problem is that what they're trying to argue, which is similar to what Plato argued, is that he claimed time is the image of eternity. And so with the spiritual ego, what happens is that the light becomes so bright in the meditation that your whole sense of self vanishes. And it's just like in deep dreamless sleep, only it's the exact opposite because it's through pure what they call jnana or knowledge, but you have to access it through what they call the what's the word, sattva. So the sattva would be the purification of the body as this increased frequency of spiritual light. So you want to see blue light because the blue light is your soul manifesting during meditation, and that in Taoism that would be the yang qi is blue light as the mercury. So the problem is that it's in the big debate between Buddhism and Vedic Brahmanism was that the Buddhists are saying no, there is no soul because you have this eternal motion, whereas in the Vedic philosophy they argue that actually the whole physical universe is an illusion because when you turn that light around, there's no sense of self anymore. There's no there's just this bright light, and therefore all motion vanishes because all you see is the bright light. So essentially what you're finding is a reversal of you're finding a dominance of visual perception over logical inference as listening. So the Buddhists were relying on actually an older philosophy of logical inference as listening, as the emptiness, whereas the Vedic Brahmins were, and it's now been proven through ancient DNA science, that they did come in from West Asia, from chariots, and that whole culture developed with after farming and the chariots and domestication of horses up in Central Asia and came back down, and so the whole idea is that you're using a symmetric ritual geometry for plow-based farming, which is patriarchal, and you're domesticating the cattle. And so the word Brahman means God, but it also means cattle or bull. And it turns out the word God actually means bull. And it's quite amazing that you'll find people say the word God over and over and over as if they're trying to be religious, but they never even once say what the etymology of the word God actually means. And I even read Karen Armstrong, a professor. She wrote a book, The History of God, and never once did she discuss the etymology of the actual word God. Which is pretty fascinating that you'd have this like psychological denial about what the actual word means, and so the Alan Danilou, who he moved to India and he wrote for the UNESCO studying music and yoga, and he points out that the Indo-European origin of the word God is from the word for bull. And that makes sense because in India, Brahman also means God and also means bull. So it makes sense that God would also mean bull. And then if you study Sumerian culture, as I've done, they have the same thing where bull also means God in the Sumerian logograms as they're called. So my point being is that this debate between Buddhism and Vedic Brahmanism actually it gets into this whole problem of the commutative symmetric geometry as a ritual origin of mathematics, which then became Platonic philosophy and what Professor David Noble calls the religion of technology. And so you have this structural trajectory of the technology that's driven by the symmetric mathematics. And this is explained in math professor Ian Stewart's book, Why Beauty is Truth, A History of Symmetry. And of course, he's promoting it. He's promoting this Platonic philosophy, but it's also what the Theosophists called the music logarithmic spiral, which was a phrase coined by Esther Watson Tipple, the daughter of Thomas Watson, who was into I don't know, Freemasonic theosophy kind of stuff. And of course, I go into all the details about that in my actual matrix plan expose that I first published online in 2001. Way back when Chris Milligan first posted it on his listserv for Yahoo for his like CIA drugs conspiracy listserv, and then he asked me to write a book about it in 2012, and then I was still researching this stuff because it's a vast philosophy of science, because you essentially can summarize all of Western civilization based on this inherent trajectory of the mathematics that drives the science. And so, based on this music logarithmic spiral, you can actually predict what is now called transhumanism. But my own research, I when I studied the secret music foundations of Western science, I then stumbled upon this music logarithmic spiral as the actual matrix plan, based on the collaboration of Andrija Puharic and philosophy of science professor um, Oliver L. Reiser, and they were working with a UN-based think tank. And I go into all that. I have a new book about that that's also free. There is no spoon, and I do get people checking out my research. It is free, but obviously, people are mainly on the internet now, so they don't have a lot of time to read books. But I do, I do provide all my citations, and these are academic books, so they're not written for prose. They're not in a prose style. But I mean, if somebody was willing to like pay me a lot of money for a book forward, then I could write like a real friendly, accessible, popularized, like maybe even like a fictionized version or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, what do people read? They read like rom-coms and murder mysteries, and So I mean, obviously, if somebody was to pay me up front, then yeah, I could write something in a style that could make it really accessible. But if I'm not being paid up front, then I don't have the time to make it all like super accessible or whatever. But at any rate, I at least I did the nuts and bolts of this citation for the research. And so if you understand this structural trajectory of Western science, people are realizing now that like Chat GPT and AI has become this surprise, surprise, this new religion that everybody is basically worshiping their AI because, well, now you can't even do a Google search now without getting AI results, and it uses tons of energy. And now these data centers are being put up everywhere. And Karen Howe has done great research on the environmental and labor costs that are externalized of AI and how it's really a religion and whatever. But she kind of says, well, we can use AI for good things. But it was she went to MIT for undergrad, but it was really David F. Noble, who was the MIT history professor. He did not get tenure because he was directly confronting this religion and technology that he traces all the way back to the 9th century in Europe as Platonic philosophy. And then his final book, Beyond the Promised Land, traces it back to the West Asian city-states, the early empires, and the changing of the Sumerian Garden of Eden mythology. And so my 2012 book, I go into how that original meaning of the Garden of Eden mythology was actually this more of a matrifocal focus. And sure enough, they just had new archaeological science published proving with DNA. They did a mitochondrial DNA, ancient DNA study proving that, in fact, the first farming cultures in Western Asia were matrifocal. So it was more like gardening before like the plow-based farming became like really dominant as monocultural. And this is what I experienced directly because I got to visit the most traditional Berber farming village in Morocco back I went in 1997, and they just got their first gravel road, and the women did all the farming. They also weaved all their own clothing from the local sheep herd. And so now they've done the ancient DNA science for that area also. And they've proven that the pastoralism spread there from cultural transmission. And then the farming came later from West Asia. But so the farming, though, is actually in that area. It's like from like 6000 BCE. So it is quite ancient. So it just shows that, by the time of like 1200 BC, you had the Iron Age developing, and in India, iron became more valuable than silver because the iron was used for weapons. So you had increased warfare by 1200 BCE, and that's really when these axial religions form that are based on the solar calendar. And so even like people study the yugas and they think they're learning some ancient wisdom, but in fact they're just learning this solar calendar patriarchal religion that's really not that different from Christianity. And because what happened is the lunar calendar got repressed. And so as I point out in my 2012 book, originally the housing was circular. And so what happened in India, as Abraham Seidenberg details, is that the area of the circle had to be made the same area as the square to try to square the circle. And so this like ancient Freemasonic ritual was really, based on the origins of patriarchy. And the circular housing was tied to the circular lunar um, rituals, the altars, for the silver tied to the lunar goddess energy that was matrifocal. And so then if you study the radical anthropologist research that I also cite in my 2012 book, Christopher Knight, his book, Blood Relations, and he's kept developing that research with Camilla Power and Jerome Lewis, and they're all professors at University College London, where my own dad attended in 1957, and as he got a Ford Foundation grant, so he did that before he went on to Sweden. But at any rate, so they've been doing great research on this ancient lunar synchronization of females as a what they argue was a sex strike is sex solidarity, which is very similar to the bonobo culture, where essentially the females cooperate together to keep the males in line. And so, like if you look at female chimpanzees, the females develop the use of spears for hunting, so they're not dependent on the males to provide them meat because the males would then demand sex in exchange for providing the meat. So the females are like, no, we're going to hunt with spears, so we're not dependent on the males. So you can really see that that's actually like the same dynamic as quote unquote civilization for humans, is that the females, what I call techno feminism, they're relying on technology to try to escape from the male physiology. That's really this increase in the stress hormones from the male primates. And so, what Robert Sapolsky is focused on, the trouble with testosterone. And so that brings you back to this whole psychic vampire problem. And so the bonobos solved it. The females have what they call G to G rubbing, the primatologists. So the female bonobos are using their physiology as a deep relaxation to maintain a peaceful culture. And then if the males cause any problems, the females just gang up on the male and nip it in the bud before it develops into a patriarchal culture. And so this is what really the Eastern yoga meditation is supposed to be about, is what, they also call it like Kundalini or Tantra, and all this is where it's supposed to be more female focused. And Professor David Gordon White has written some excellent books on this that I cite in my 2012 book. But the problem is that even now in our so-called, like liberated high technology era of twerking and everything else on the internet, the males are still like afraid of their own of the power of females. And so that's why we're having this big like backlash in our current time, where we're against the use of technology by females to essentially protect themselves from the mistake of males. And so all of this is symptomatic and a cover up of the original male problem. So in our original human culture, all the males were required to do this training where they'd go off together alone for a month, and they just do the dancing all the time to then physically sublimate their energy, but also purify it. And so they would do fasting, and then that's how they would access this spiritual energy that they called gum. So they taught to visualize fire below the water in the base of your spine. And that's this teaching, it's found in both the Pygmies and the San Bushmen. And the ancient DNA science has shown that they physically separated 225,000 years ago. So this is an ancient teaching indeed, that was the focus of what it truly means to be human. And then it started to get lost 10,000 years ago. And so that's why we have such a deep conundrum today as far as what it means to be human. And my own training manual goes into how to reverse that, the ancient advanced acoustic alchemy. So I just find it really fascinating that you have this movie where they're discovering the Eastern philosophy, this garden murder case, and this was about 90 years ago. And I'm going to post the trailer link right here. And so they're like flirting with this whole pagan gleam in the eye thing. And the evil eye is, again, it's obviously practiced in like Central Europe, like the Gypsies or whatever. I mean, it's an ancient thing even in Europe, but it goes back to India, obviously. And it's like, well, we have it like inverted in the West. We have that whole meaning inverted because of this deep patriarchal problem that then got covered up by techno feminism as a way to try to cope with this deeper physiological male problem. And so now we have this crisis of the primate the dominant primate species now accelerating the planet into biological annihilation, which is it's a Google Scholar term, biological annihilation. And so if you go to like arcticnews.blogspot.com, you get the actual empirical evidence of just how bad the ecological crisis is. Whereas for the rest of the internet, if you even mention, global warming, it triggers everyone to say, "Oh, that's a liberal elite conspiracy to depopulate the planet and blah blah blah." But in fact, the science for global warming is 200 years old from Joseph Fourier. And then the ecological crisis itself is a byproduct of this exponential symmetric mathematics that's accelerating. So that's what my 2012 book goes into. And of course, it's too complex for people to wrap their heads around. So I just kind of threw it all together, threw it out there, and then I did the follow-up book on Andrija Puharich. And Netflix is supposed to be coming out with the documentary about Andrija Puharich, which there's a website for. And the director of that documentary, he did contact me to get more details about what I had discovered in my research on Andrija Puharich. But the son is the controlling factor for the documentary, because the son has more of his dad's research papers and wants to make sure his dad is respected and shown in a positive light. And so I have no idea when that documentary will actually get released and shown to the public. And just by seeing who is in the documentary, I'm not really expecting a lot from it, but it would at least get the information out to a broader audience once it's on Netflix. And it'd be a good introduction to the topic. And even now, people are starting to talk about Andrija Puharich more in the conspiracy scene. And then I just point out, well, actually, I did just write a book on him, and I've been researching him for, at least 20 years when I first discovered this actual matrix plan, right after I finished my master's thesis. So essentially, I wrote my master's thesis on what I called sound current non-dualism. And I'm totally doing my own thing. Like, even my advisors did not understand what I was doing. And somebody offered to publish my master's thesis after it was put online by the webmaster for Ken Wilber, who's like a New Age guru guy. And I was critiquing Ken Wilber. I was trying to contact Ken Wilber to get his response to my critique of him. And so instead, his webmaster's like, "Well, let me just throw your thing on our website." And then that's why this guy who said he would promote my book in Germany, but he admitted he did not understand my master's thesis, and he did his undergraduate in physics, and he published on music and science. And so I studied his work to see, maybe I could understand what the confusion's about. And that's when I realized, when he pointed out that the Tai Chi is not a fractal, that's when I realized, oh, that's what I got confused about in my own master's thesis. And then I discovered this music logarithmic spiral matrix plan, which completely corroborated my own master's thesis, because it was another version of the sound current non-dualism claim, only it was done by this guy who did his PhD on it. He called it non-dualism in action, or I think it might have been like creative monism is what he was calling it. But so it's like suddenly I discovered this whole esoteric philosophy of science subculture that was tied to the UN and the Institute of Advanced Study, and even Einstein was involved in it. And I had been going totally on my own, up until then, and all of a sudden I was corroborated. But then I did not agree with their research, and then I discovered Alon Khan, the Fields Medal math professor, and I realized that what he was saying about music theory was the same secret that I had figured out on my own when I was in high school. And then I'm like, well, maybe he's just being metaphorical. I couldn't believe that it was the same thing. And I wrote about this in 2006. I published an article for a parapsychology website that had asked me to submit articles, and then I kind of forgot about it. I kept on reading more and more science because I'm trying to like double check my research and find out, well, maybe there's something else out there, and getting into chaos science and other mathematics, and and so then finally I find his lecture on YouTube. Somebody had posted his lecture in 2017 on what he called music of shapes. And so he goes into the music theory in detail in that lecture. And I realized, no, this is the exact same secret. And then he goes into our brain perception. At the end of that talk from 2017, he's like, well, actually, this is how our brains work, is that we're doing this like Fourier transform on space-time itself as non-commutative time frequency. And that's exactly what I was arguing in 1996 when I was critiquing Ken Wilber and Slavoj Žižek, um, and that's what got me into my graduate program. So I was totally doing my own thing, and then Alon Khan suddenly is corroborating my claim, and he's got a Fields Medal in mathematics, and he's the only one I can find who's making the same claim about music. And so then I realized he was giving that same talk in several different versions. And luckily, you can find later versions of it on YouTube because they all got posted on YouTube, but he also has it in written form. And so then I had to really like decode what he specifically meant by the mathematics in terms of the non-commutative inversion of the exponentials or whatever. I mean, because I study the philosophy, but I do not do the mathematics. I come at it from music, and then I practice it as meditation. So then I find this other math professor corroborating that, in fact, this is a Pythagorean, music theory that Alon Khan is talking about. And so that was precisely what I had been saying all along since I was in high school. I literally told my piano teacher when I was like 15 years old that I think this Pythagorean philosophy is what harmonizes, all of reality. And after that, they started giving me like these mystic music kind of books, and then my my music teacher, he gave me the Gregory Bateson's Mind and Nature book when I graduated from high school for me to read, and I read that my first year of college. But I really had to study it because Gregory Bateson was really struggling with these complex ideas about logic and systems theory and stuff, and he could not solve them. And so then after I discovered Long Con, then I was like, well, somebody else must have realized that the secret of meditation is non-commutativity, because I'm just researching this on my own. I've told this story numerous times, but I had been posting on this Dow Bums website, but nobody there could understand what I was saying, or they would like try to dismiss me. So I'm like, okay, I just kept searching the internet, searching and searching. Finally, I discovered Eddie Oceans working at Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Well, it turns out he got into his whole field because he was trying to understand Gregory Bateson. He said, look, this solves the paradox that Gregory Bateson was trying to solve. And he had literally like worked with Gregory Bateson on this problem. And so it like, tied together all the loose ends, so to speak, of the various disciplines I had studied that, are basically all subfields of non-commutativity. Because, as Alon Khan points out, all of science thus far has been based on commutative geometry. And that's what is meant by this symmetry is the truth as beauty concept is its commutative geometry. So when you realize that actually that's wrong, that the truth is actually non-commutative, as this quantum algebra, that then you realize that, I had already realized there was a structural drive of science from the mathematics. And this is what Karl Marx actually figured out in terms of economics, but he was still using, logarithmic mathematics for the supply and demand model. So when he figured out the surplus value of labor, he was still confined in the wrong paradigm of the wrong symmetric mathematics. And so that's why David F. Noble, is critiquing Marxism as much as he's critiquing capitalism, because they both rely on this Platonic philosophy of technology as what Marx called the Edenic respite of labor. In other words, automation is just going to save us and it's going to be wonderful. And David Noble was focused on that not being true. That automation is the number one cause of job loss. And so the whole concept of what is efficiency, and even to this day, I mean, you find it's like the whole Doge thing. People really fell for that. It's like, well, we got to have efficiency, and so you can just see how these are deeply rooted problems in how people are taught in education, because most people, they learn in a practical sense. So like their dad will teach them how to fix things. So they learn like machinery, they learn how to repair things, they learn how to use tools, they learn, really great skills. Like they learn, vocational skills that are very valuable because they're practical. So they'll learn, plumbing and electricity and how to fix motors and stuff like that, and construct houses using the Pythagorean theorem. And the whole time they're not realizing that all this is driven by the language of science, which is the mathematics, and based on this structural definition of space-time as like a linear time within space that's symmetric. And so then a person could be really highly educated in terms of what their skill set is, what their expertise is, whether they're a mechanic, or they might study a specific, like electronics and using computers to whatever. I mean, you can, it's obviously everything's specialized in our high-tech society. But when you, like, if you read, Ian Stewart's book, why a history of symmetry, you realize that, well, yeah, there is this structural drive of science based on the symmetry of mathematics. So essentially, you have an increase in the dimensions that you learn in mathematics. By the time you get to you have cubic equations, and by the time you get to the fifth dimension, you have to use matrices. And when you use the matrices, then you get this non-commutative matrices. But what happens even in the non-commutative matrices, as Basil J. Haley points out, is that they use the Poisson bracket to then cover up the asymmetric time, that's non-local. So this is what Basil J. Haley's final work was really focused on, was non-local time that's asymmetric, or non-commutative time that's non-local. And that's what I had originally contacted him about 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. And I last heard back from him in 2023. And he replied to me about my music article. He was nice about my music article. But what I find highly ironic is that as I closely followed his work, other physicists did not understand him, because they would completely ignore the non-commutativity. And that's even happened after, he's passed on. Like the supposed talks that are given in his honor are ignoring the whole focus of his work, which was non-commutativity, in his final, past like 20 years. And so, I mean, he would directly confront Roger Penrose about non-commutativity. And Roger Penrose, I mean, like I mentioned before, I mean, he admitted he's not good at non-commutative math. So that's essentially why I've never done I mean, I can do, like I tested it, I think it was 91% in the ACT on mathematics. I never studied for it or anything, but I did fine if I wanted to, but I just disagreed with the logic of the mathematics, and because of my music training. And so then then I contacted math professor Luke Hoffman about the non-commutative Pythagorean theorem, and he was like, "What, you mean this?" And he had not published it yet. Um, but then he disagreed with me because I'm like, "Well, this is the truth of reality." He's like, "No, you start with the commutative geometry, and then you build into the non-commutative." But Basil J. Hiley, his whole point is that the foundation of reality is actually this non-commutative, um, and it's not the other way around. So the big problem is that physicists and scientists, they learn classical physics first, and this is what my own physics professor emphasizes, that everybody's learning the wrong physics in high school, and so they essentially are getting brainwashed by the wrong mathematics and the wrong physics. And my quantum physics professor, he taught quantum physics the first year of college because he's like, everybody needs to learn the proper foundation of reality, which is this non-locality, that he called the Dirac dance. He would show this, the Dirac dance thing, and he's saying like every 0 point of space time has this going on at the that's superluminal, and and the so the problem is that when people finally do learn non-commutativity, then they try to project it back onto the commutative physics, and they say, well, you have this, that, and so that, Basil J. Haley is saying that's even the error that Richard Feynman made, is that what he called renormalization was actually this attempt to then put quantum physics onto relativity, when in fact it's the other way around, that the non-locality is the true foundation of reality. And so it kind of almost gets you back to the debate between Buddhists and Brahmin priests, way back, I don't know, 2,000 years ago or something. But yeah, so in terms of the future of what's going to happen on Earth, I'm not, people say you're supposed to be hopeful when you don't know what's going to happen, but essentially I've been arguing that algae is the means to save life on Earth, because 80% of oil and coal is from algae, and algae relies on this quantum non-commutative 100% energy efficiency transfer based on the blue light, which is like the sole energy of in humans, is this blue light. And so, you can eat algae as spirulina, but also our mitochondria come from algae originally, and that's what really powers our body, is the mitochondria. And also when we go out in nature by like trees in the forests, they're emitting infrared light that then directly powers the mitochondria. So I'll just leave it right there. And thanks for letting me rant. For whoever listened, one or two people, and you can always follow up later on.